All right, we will, we've had a slight break. Time now is 10:20, and we will be resuming the commutation reprieve hearing for Mr. Robert Moorman. And Ms. Hall, if you want to proceed.
Mr. and Mrs. Mayers, the board is familiar with you, acquainted with you from Mr. King's clemency hearing, but would you just briefly, for the record, introduce yourselves?
I'm told I want to be on the other side of this.
Just introduce yourself.
I'm Nancy Mayers.
And I'm George Mayers. Nancy is an author, and she has written an essay about the death penalty. And in order to do that, she began a correspondence with originally 12 inmates of death row. And we have been corresponding with those men, and their numbers now are 5.
For about 13 years? For about 13 years, I think.
So we've been corresponding with Robert himself for 11 years. More than 11 years.
So what is your relationship with Robert?
We have some of his material here. One thing that we can bring is, and it is his voice. This speaks for us. This is Robert in a letter to us. You both are like family to me.
So he's one of the children. We have a flexible number of children, and Robert is certainly one of them.
He's been very candid with us in times of crisis, for instance. Could I read something from a letter where he responds to... I wrote to him about a beloved aunt who had passed away. So I've got to dig around here through his letters. I have here, incidentally, 31 of his essays. You've heard already what a writer he is. We won't read from all of those, but
We promise.
we have quite a body of his work here, and we know his voice very well. This is part of our relationship. I'm very sorry to hear that your aunt has passed away, but she's now at peace, out of pain, not sick, but in heaven with our Heavenly Father. She is watching over you, enjoying being with him. Others, she knows, not sad but happy. He writes a smiley face. Keep the positive things you remember about her in your heart. Live life the way she would want you to do, not sad but full of love, happiness, caring for others as you have been doing. Now, that's very typical of his voice, the religious references and the knowledge of us and our pain.
No, I really would rather let them hear some of Robert's voice than have them hear us talking about. You've heard a lot about Robert. I would like to read some excerpts, and I promise not from 31 essays, just a couple of essays that will acquaint you with how Robert feels about the world, about his crime, and kind of illuminate also that he's not, I can say as a writer myself, not a born writer, but a very willing one. So we valued his correspondence.
Can you describe can you describe what's unique about Robert compared to the other death row inmates that you write to?
Well, among other things, I think he's probably the most intellectually impaired of all of our correspondents. That stands out for me, that he has such I won't say sunny attitude, but a beautiful attitude, serene, and he's empathic, even though he's not very intelligent.
Of all the prisoners that we've known, and the 12, he's the only individual who really has confronted what he's done and is remorseful. And we can read some of his words if you want to do that at this point.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Are you able to read these?
I think so. If you get all the right thing.
This is an essay called Incest. All of these essays have come to us within the last 5 years. We have a huge body of his work, but this is recent work.
Incest is wrong before God and man. Those who believe it is okay are being mistaken, lead others to a sinful life. We need to truly teach all children, adults, that it is wrong. There is a price to pay now before God, Jesus. So many children are their parent, mom or dad, sex toy, or cousins, aunts, uncles, in-laws are doing sexual acts with family members. But many believe it is okay to have sex with a daughter or son, cousin, aunt, uncle, in-laws, brother or sisters. I was told that it is okay for family to do sexual things in the family, but it is wrong to do it outside of the family.
Let me ask you this. I don't think you mentioned this, that you're both retired English teachers.
Yes, we are.
And so I'm guessing you've had thousands of students between the two of you. I'm curious, based on your experience as educators, where would Robert fit into the educational system?
We've all taught a number of levels. I've taught in a neighborhood center in Tucson, adult basic education, and I have taught a few men like Robert who are very slow. I've taught severely mentally ill. I'm perhaps not qualified to make that diagnosis, but these are diagnoses that have been given to me. I've taught some severely retarded students as well. They come into a neighborhood center because it's a place to pursue some intellectual endeavor that appeals to them. So I've taught perhaps algebra to a person who is gifted in math and otherwise perhaps totally inarticulate. Robert would come in because he loves writing, and I would love to work with him on his writing. It doesn't really improve. Nothing really changes for Robert, but he loves to write, and I think he's writing his way out of the crisis of his life. I think he writes to address what's become of him and his hopes for redemption. He's very candid about that. You want to add anything?
No, I'll just leave.
All right.
Let's do one more.
Read some more.
Just one more.
This is called child abuse.
When a child is abused, they can become filled with hate, anger, revenge. These kids will go to wild parties, get into trouble. I know how abuse can affect a kid. Being abused by friends, some strangers, etc. I got into all types of trouble, beginning with hurting other kids, some adults, running off, not really caring who I did or who I hurt. My anger, hate, untrusting, uncaring got me sent to juvenile prison 2 times, then as an adult to adult prison, then to death row. And can you give me the next page there? All the time I was doing bad things, something was bothering me. I felt an empty need inside, so I would do more weird, uncaring things to try to fill that empty need I had, stop the uncaring feeling inside. Every time I did something bad, nothing would fill that empty area or get rid of the things with females of uncaring feelings. But rather, each seemed to make things worse. I'd done all types of sexual things with females, stolen, destroyed property, abused younger kids, older people, in many bad ways. but I never used unlawful drugs. Did do drinking. About 4 years, about 4 years after he had first been in prison, he was sentenced to die for his stepmom's death. I was on a 72-hour pass from prison. I have to admit that in prison I had wrongful thoughts, feelings towards some people. Okay, and then on the next page.
But all my life, God had been there watching over me. Okay, continue.
Yeah.
One more.
Just brief, yeah.
Okay.
His health has been precarious for a long time, as people with diabetes often experience. And he had got sent to the hospital. And when I got back, I was taken to the medical unit, and a doctor told me I had a really messed up heart. My lungs were also badly messed up. That scared me more than being in the hospital. I started thinking about what laid ahead if I died. One day, shortly after I got back, I made a decision to turn my life over to the Lord and to live for Him. I got down onto my knees in my cell. I made a complete confession of all my wrongful acts and deeds and asked Him to forgive me and to come into my heart and help me. Take that. And help me. It was like a mountain had been lifted off my heart. I never, ever had a feeling of peace before. But that moment I felt a peace I had not felt before, and a joy came into my whole body, heart, soul, and total love. And that's the Robert that we know, the one who has had a conversion experience and who is, despite his deficiencies, spiritually rich and deserves the opportunity to continue that development for his natural life. So we're asking for clemency.
Thank you very much.
Dogs don't back up naturally. Not the teachers.
Dr. Gerald Knowles? Please. Does he look the same? Will you tell the board how you know Mr. Moorman? I'm sorry, Bobby. You don't know a Mr. Moorman, do you?
I know Bobby, yes. I got a job teaching at the laboratory school at Northern Arizona University, 6th grade, and I knew about Bobby's experience in 5th grade, which I found out later was probably a misinterpretation and totally, but I had him in my 6th grade class, and of all of the students I've had over 280 elementary students, and I spent 1,400 hours with Bobby, and he was probably the most handicapped student I ever had, emotionally, socially, and certainly physically, and I think it was my own experience in school, being put out of third grade in Catholic school. I developed some empathy, and I actually, that whole year, did everything I could to try to compensate for what I saw Bobby was struggling with. One thing I always remember, and he may remember this too, he would have these anxiety attacks. More like he was almost, I have a Labradoodle at home who does that, and it's just like a wild animal that is confused and afraid and doesn't know what to do.
Do you ever notice any particular triggers for those anxiety attacks?
A lot of the interaction socially had to do with that, but I also noticed I had a lot of student teachers. Female student teachers caused a lot of anxiety in Bobby, and it's in sort of a subtle thing about his relationship with his mom, and their little behaviors that told me that it was, would say, unpleasant or a problem. Bobby intellectually had a horrible time. I think he was reading at second grade level in the sixth grade, and but I found in order to deal with him, in terms of academically, we had first to help him socially. This self-image, this self-concept was so bad, and it was reinforced. Kids that are 12-year-olds are not kind, So we did all we could, even in football, and he'll remember telling him to go stand there and put your arms out and catch a pass. And he did. And everybody said, great Bobby, and this was an affirmation to me that you could begin to manipulate the environment for kids to give them a chance at success, and that was just one example. I remember, I can almost see the day. I had a lab school where I had sometimes 10 students, undergraduates, sitting in the back of the room. I had some problem kids. I had some kids that I think were violent.
Was Bobby one of them?
No. Not any time during that whole year did Bobby have any violent interface with another student. His anxiety came from something deep inside him, and there was no way I would predict a violent behavior later in life. I'm the most surprised person of all. In some ways I'm not surprised how Bobby has tried to meet the challenges in his life, like he did in the classroom. He would just get so uptight and nervous, but he would not strike out toward any other student. He was not a behavior problem in the room. We had 30 students in there. He wasn't a behavior problem.
Would you describe Bobby physically at that age and how his physical appearance affected him socially?
Well, I almost want to react with anger about why this happened, but Bobby used to walk on his toes because of what I learned later was cerebral palsy, and he was bent over. He drooled a lot. They kept his head shaved, which was the days of the crew cut. I had one myself, but his head was shaved, which I thought was unusual. He had a mole on his face. He had his eyes were almost to me like an animal when you see a deer sometimes, because he couldn't see. He had that one good eye. They had painted polish over it, hoping that would help the bad eye. And all the time he would look, he really strained to see. And I found out later that a lot of times Bobby, and I found out later, kids like him will play around with color and light to get that stimulation. And so physically, he really had a lot of problems, particularly the walking on his toes, and you'll remember that. But he still caught a pass in football. He remembers. He also played the part in Ebenezer Scrooge's Christmas Carol.
Tell the board about that.
Yeah. I had sixth graders who where there was no script. They took and read the eighth grade version of prose and poetry, and they made up their lines. They even had their own director, and I couldn't believe it. I've done a lot of things with kids, expectations, and they far exceeded anything I expected. And Bobby played, I forgot the roles that he played, but I have a picture of that taken in 1962. Bobby wasn't in it. I wish he was. I could show you. But it was great.
So he learned his lines.
Oh, yeah, yeah. We went over and over again, and that's what's so important.
A little bit of a struggle then.
It was a struggle. We went over, and he remembers. You remember? We went over and over. And it was just so great to see him play that role in front of a group of people, students. And
Now, beyond being an elementary school teacher, you do have a doctorate in education.
yes, real quick, I wanted to be a Catholic priest and decided that wasn't for me. So I came back, became a teacher, a sixth grade teacher, because there were no openings in the public high school in Flagstaff. I taught 3 years in the public schools, and then I got a job in the laboratory school. And the job in the laboratory school said, you have to go to graduate school. I was lucky enough to have some people who got me to the University of Illinois, I got my doctorate at Illinois, and from there I went to ASU a year. I was a department chairman at ASU one summer. Why I ever left Arizona on a rainy day to go back to Indiana to Purdue, I think it was a good thing for me. So I was at Purdue 3 years and did some special projects in Gary, Indiana, and came back to, I went to Temple University for a year. Came back to Arizona to do some special projects at NAU.
So safe to say, over the years, you've taught and observed thousands of students?
Well, yes, yeah, I was trying to count that today. I worked on the Navajo Nation, and there were 300 teacher aides that we observed in a different cultural context. I opened a school on the Apache White River Nation at CBQ. So I've been outside watching, and I supervised a lot of student teachers in that time. So, I could gauge the behavior of the student teacher and also watch how the kids were reacting. In fact, we even did an analysis of that kind of thing. So I think I'm a pretty good reader of a person's behavior.
Based on your experience and observations, did you believe that Bobby was properly classified as a mentally retarded child?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. My daughter teaches 12 autistic kids in Portland, and absolutely. And it just breaks my heart that in 1 year we couldn't make the changeover and the difference, Yeah.
So you traveled here from Colorado
Yes,
to see
700.
Bobby for the first time in
I haven't seen him in
almost
50
years.
Yeah. We started communicating after I got contacted by the capital punishment people here, I think in Arizona, through a lawyer in California, and we started corresponding for a while. And then my life changed and got busy. And I wrote Bobby and I said, I feel sad and ashamed that I broke off that communication.
Can you tell the board how you feel about Bobby being executed next week?
Well, I can't really tell them how I feel. It's absolutely absurd. I'll open up with that idea. It's just unbelievable. I know what the headlines have said and the reports have said. I stood up for him in 1972 in Flagstaff, Arizona, and said, do not send this fellow to a penitentiary. He needs a supportive system. We knew that. And I knew when he left that sixth grade and went into public schools who rejected him, he needs a supportive system. He's incapable of meeting the challenges each stage. When he was an infant, when he went to school in the can-do, he couldn't do, and on as a young adult. When I heard about what he did and to get in prison in the first place, I said, oh, that's absolutely, that's classical. Knowing him and know how he tried to deal with and cope with his life, that's what a person would do.
He just didn't have the problem-solving abilities
He didn't
that
have
he
it.
should have
He
had.
didn't have it, yeah. And So I would say, I don't know. I talked to a priest yesterday I was his mentor. He hadn't seen him in 50 years, a Franciscan and up on White River on Apache. And he'd gotten a call from his mother, who's 90 years old, who talked about Bobby and what might and could happen to him. And so she was concerned too. And so he said Mass for Bobby that day. And anyway, yes, I would feel, well, I guess there's plenty of time to cry, when things happen to people that you think are unjust. And that would be, what was it, Lincoln and Walt Whitman cried over all the people that were killed in the Civil War. I think you have to get rid of that grieving and I just absolutely hope that never happens.
All right, Dr. Knowles, thank you very much. I'm sorry, did the board have any questions?
Yeah.
And I also should have mentioned before that Dr. Conti is available by phone today. If the board has any questions for him, we're able to reach him.
Thank you.
Deacon Ed Sheffer?
If you don't mind, I'll pull this out. It's very difficult to hear back there. Robert? Board, thank you for having me here.
Would you tell the board a little bit about your background and how you know Mr. Moorman?
Yeah, and I'll try to keep that short. I've known Robert for well over a decade. Prior to that, it might be significant to know that I had a life outside of the church in the sense of being ordained for a number of years. I worked in the corporate world. I was a president of a company. I was a chief operating officer of a company, and so I had a vocation later in life. As part of that vocation and ordination, I had been involved in hospice work, providing bereavement to those that were dying and to their families. I was also involved in elder care and providing and developing spiritual programs that brought life to the elderly. And it was in the nature of that that the bishop of the Diocese of Tucson had called me in. There was something, he had a communication that was going on with Robert, and it involved that. So he had asked me, because of my experience in a couple of areas, would I get involved in this situation, and that he would take direction based on that. He wanted to have firsthand knowledge of something. So that required me going through the process of getting cleared to go into death row. And my experience, very first experience on death row, was with Robert, as is today with the board in this situation. So quickly, I didn't understand, and I felt inadequate, to be candid with you. But as I met Robert, and we sat down and we talked behind closed doors, it quickly came clear to me that what he was really after was something that he longed for in his heart, and that was a spiritualness. Although he had come to an understanding maybe that there was a God, there wasn't a deep connection to it. There wasn't a real sincere relationship with it all. But he was hungry for that. If it was real, he wanted to know that that was real. And so we began. I had requested that he correspond and share some things first, because the truth is, I wanted the truth, and it wasn't about the case or what he had done, but who he was as a person, and the sincerity of it all. And so that led to some more communication back and forth, and then it began having visitations where we would sit and we would talk about the deeper things in a person's heart, and how do I truly experience God, and not do that from the sidelines.
How many?
And so,
I'm sorry. How often have you visited Robert in the last 10 years?
probably more than I can count, at least once a month, sometimes more than that. And I continue to do other things as well.
And in addition to those countless hours of visitation, you have a pretty thick file of
Yeah, I
correspondence as
saw
well.
a correspondence file here, and mine is probably 2 of those back and forth, but yeah.
What have you learned about Robert, not only spiritually, but also in terms of his intellectual and cognitive functioning over all these years?
You know, in no offense to Robert, but I think he understands this already himself, that he does deal intellectually on a slower level. It's apparent in his writings. He'll go to a certain place, and then, you know, you have to go beyond that. So there's, you know, some adaptive skills that are missing.
Do you get to deeper levels of theological discussion with Robert?
You know, and it's a challenging question. And the truth of the matter is, if you take something that's ethereal out there, and if you can really bring it down to earth to its elementary form, God will connect with any human being. So in that respect, absolutely, he understands where he's at in relationship to God. He has a real relationship in that. It's not important that we discuss, you know, whether it be canon laws or deep theology and what the relevance, the deeper meaning of all that is, but an understanding of who I am as a person, what my responsibility as a person is. Yes, he does understand that, and he personally has taken ownership in his own life for who he is as a human being. You know, some of the conversations and things that we've discussed are privileged, but he understands, and his pain is real like anybody else's. He understands the wrong in his life and the roads that he took that weren't right.
So have you observed genuine remorse?
Absolutely, but you know, it is all about that in the end. You know, it's the journey for many of us Christians that are here has just begun in this Lenten journey that leads ultimately to the cross, and that road is about Christ came to give us the message of who God really is and who we are in relationship, and that we're all called, every one of us, to reform in one way or another. So has he reformed, and is he a different person than that person that I first met? Significantly different, but it's, and I'd share with you what's kind of interesting when you do this, because I never felt called to this. Again, it started with him, but there's the scripture passage about unless you become like a child, you'll never enter the kingdom of God. I understand that in a different light now. Robert was the very first one. And it was after working months with Robert, maybe 5 or 6 months, that all of a sudden I got a letter from another individual who was in his pod. And there was something about Robert that had changed. There was something that was different about him. And this other person that was in that pod, I guess, was longing for that. And so we began to have a correspondence and pretty much going through the same routine that Robert and I went through. And then shortly after that, there was another individual who was on death row, who was suicidal, who I had gotten a letter from, would I be willing to work with him? And that ultimately, let me just cut to the chase, of me working with 7 different individuals that are on death row in their spirituality. And I want to make it perfectly clear, it's not about indoctrination, it's not about trying to get someone, to win somebody over to the team or to a certain denomination. As a matter of fact, that isn't what this ministry is all about. It's about a person's spirituality, and each and every one of us have that, and it's tapping into that with God. And that childlike person is the one who instituted that and got that rolling. And every one of these guards that's here, the deputy here and the wardens, can tell you that all of these inmates are not the same. They're not the same. And that there's those that are at a different place of peace in their heart. There's those that are just different. They're just different. And I would classify Robert in that category.
Thank you very much.
I'm Denise Young, and I had the privilege of also being one of Robert Moorman's lawyers for some years now. And I would now like to present Dr. Jack Potts. Many of you may know him, a psychiatrist here in Arizona, who we asked to assess Robert and ask him about his findings. Dr. Potts?
Thank you.
Can you, first, Dr. Potts, whoops. Can you,
Mr. Moorman?
it's been a while, huh?
It's been a while.
Dr. Potts, could you first give us a little bit of your background for
I'd
the
like
board?
to thank you for listening to me, or at least having me here this morning. I'm a physician, specialized in psychiatry. From University of Wisconsin. I'm currently in private practice. I spent 15 years in jail, working at the county jail with thousands and thousands of inmates. Dozens of people are now on death row. I then spent 8 years at the Superior Court in Maricopa County as the head of forensic services for the Superior Court. I have worked with both Mr. Ayler and Mr. Bizzazzo before. I've worked for the prosecution. Most cases I'm appointed by the court to do evaluations. I am currently on the University of Arizona as I'm a clinical instructor with the U of A. I've been an adjunct professor of law at ASU, as well as social work. I'm licensed in various jurisdictions. I practice clinical psychiatry as well as forensic psychiatry. And I testified, again, as I say, on capital cases both for the defense and prosecution. So I've been doing this quite a while. I also have helped develop curricula for the Arizona Peace Officers Standards and Training. I was asked by Ms. Young years ago in 1997 approximately to evaluate Mr. Moorman. In doing so, I reviewed numerous documents, including Dr. Conti's, Dr. Froming's work product. I saw a good portion of Dr. Conti's interview this morning. I reviewed numerous medical records from the state hospital and the like.
Did you also review records on Mr. Moorman's foster care placements?
Yeah, yes, I did. There was some, what's very interesting in medicine, the most important diagnostic tool we have is history. And you can't fake your history. This man had problems prior to 2 years of age and had continuing problems. This man was born condemned. He did not have a choice.
And when you say condemned, what do you mean by that? By the disabilities that you found?
Yeah, a number of things. First, the genetics for problems are probably 50% of who we are is a genetic makeup. The rest can be sometimes influenced by environment, as a teacher was talking about earlier, Dr. Doles. And when you come and you have the first 2 years are taken from you, that's when issues of basic trust versus mistrust are developed. Can you rely on your parent being there? Secondly, he had what we'd probably call gross field defects. These are neurologic and other developmental issues that are probably congenital, if not genetic in origin. They can't neatly put into, well, he's Down syndrome, or he's got this disability here. You had a person who has clear, he had club foot, he had some issues with speech, cognition, vision. So these are whole field defects with which he was born, which caused some real issues, obviously with bonding, et cetera, later on. So that's part of the history, because as of 2 and 3, the records from the physicians reflect that he was having these problems.
Did you also review any records from the many times that he was hospitalized at the Arizona State Hospital?
Yes, the records from this first hospitalization, I mean, again, I have dealt with malingerers, I have dealt with people who try and feign mental illness, and I teach on these issues. It's hard to fake your history. That's why you look at collateral source information. He was hospitalized at State Hospital. I think he was 13 the first time. He then was hospitalized later in 1972. He has seen a plethora of doctors, all of whom consider him to have problems, including Dr. Harrison Baker, with whom I worked years ago when he was one of the first psychiatrists at the Alhambra unit. Dr. Baker thought he was maybe malingering, faking to some extent, but also prescribed him potent medications If someone's malingering, you don't give medicines. That's unethical and malpractice. You have to have an indication. Dr. Michael Cleary, who is a colleague of mine, who currently works here, I believe, still, at one point said that there was something really wrong with him. I believe Dr. Cleary would have liked to have been here today, but was precluded to do so because DOC did not permit him to do so, is my understanding. I didn't talk to Michael about coming. And Dr. Cleary is very much a prosecutorially oriented witness. He tends to look at things that way, even though he's a good forensic shrink. But
As a result of that, then, did you assign even greater weight to Dr. Cleary's opinion?
It is, yes, because it's, I respect Dr. Cleary. I can disagree with my colleagues. Not a problem. We can generally disagree. That's what medicine is about. It's not adversarial, it's collegial. So we try and come to things. But we can disagree. But when I look at someone like Dr. Baker saying something and Dr. Cleary, who's clearly more prosecution, I say, whoa, they're seeing something wrong with this person. Mr. Moorman, it will probably be one of the worst pieces of protoplasm that you will ever see come in front of you because of his field defects, his congenital problems, his history, his cognitive deficits. Just looking at the gentleman, you know something's wrong. In medicine, there's a syndrome called FLK, and it truly is, it's what pediatricians use, funny-looking kid. And you still use it today because we just can't put a finger exactly what it is, but he's a funny-looking kid. Something's wrong. And it's still used in pediatrics and medical schools today because you know it's there, but you can't pinpoint it. In this case, there's such a field of defects that were there from birth.
And does that include the severe vision impairment that we've heard about, the difficulty he had even walking?
Clearly, well, I didn't realize at one point he'd been walking on his toes as if cerebral palsy. He clearly had some cognitive deficits. The documents speak for themselves, and what's even more important is it was all documented prior to his involvement with the criminal justice system, and furthermore, he was receiving treatment for decades after the involvement because he's been in a controlled environment, and people still say something's wrong, he needs to be on these potent medications. If he didn't need to be on them, the doctors wouldn't prescribe them. And it's not like Mr. Moorman's there saying, hey, give me something to play Rip Van Winkle, or give me some Valium. He's not asking for the stuff. The docs are seeing the problems. So what you have is 15, 20 different people seeing something that we don't know how to specifically define it, but it is an organic brain syndrome, and that means something's wrong with his brain, and it's manifested in various ways, including speech, vision, his walking, his cognition, judgment. So we know something's wrong. Trouble is we don't do biopsies of the brain too often. We can't pinpoint it, but there's a gross field defects. Just by looking at Mr. Moorman, you know that.
I'd like to now move a bit to your opinion, again, after reviewing all the records that we provided you, about the most serious aspect in this case, which is his sexual abuse by his mother and then his mother's ultimate death. How did you reach your conclusion about whether Mr. Moorman's reports to you about what happened between he and his mother, whether they were valid or not?
There's a couple of points. Number one, my role wasn't to go over his criminal culpability. He had been adjudicated guilty on this. Number two, the records I reviewed reflect that there was some very odd relationship going on, and the probation officer, Medrano, I believe, noted that fairly clearly in the reports back in '79. Number three, there's a consistency in his presentation and his presentation to others. He is not, I don't think anyone can say, even Dr. Baker at one point thought he was being disingenuous, but I don't know what goes on in this gentleman's brain. And I don't think any of us have seen him being disingenuous. He may be for a short period of time, but what we see is what we get. He presents now as he did 10 years ago, as he did 20 years ago, as he did to the doctor when he was 3 years of age and 6 to the teachers. So that consistency is very telling. I did not look at issues of culpability. You know, I said there's a likelihood he might be insane because that's a different standard and the standards have changed since the crime was committed and the law was changed, and I worked on that law with Senator Noland, the Judiciary Committee. But that was an issue that I wasn't to look at. My main issue was to look at what do we have going on here. How can I, as a physician, who's did some training at Barrows as part of my training, how can we put this together? What's going on? And it is the gross field defect manifested by his visual problems, by his gait problems, by his cognitive problems, by his judgment problems, by his articulation problems.
And you mentioned Dr. Cleary, who, as you said, also was an expert in this case called by the prosecution and is now a physician at the Arizona Department of Corrections. He, too, believed that the abuse had, in fact, occurred. Is that right?
That is my understanding.
In fact, what he had said, and it's on page 11 of your report, if you want to look at it, Dr. Cleary said, the details he provided seemed to hang together and were both consistent and feasible. As disturbing as his story is, numerous clinicians have accepted it as accurate, and I saw nothing to indicate otherwise. Did that impact at all your final opinion on whether this abuse did occur?
It was part of the puzzle. You know, there may be some data points every now and then that are way off. You have to look at where most of the data is. And all the docs are consistent in their evaluation. And we're all coming from different viewpoints. It's a collegial. If we were to sit down and staff this, I think we'd all agree there's something seriously wrong, that there's gross evidence of this abuse that had occurred by his mother when he was at an early age, by his adopted mother. And this man is just a very sad individual who was condemned from birth because of this and not having a corrective environment. That's the kicker. You can fix some of this, but you have to have the corrective, supportive environment. And if you don't get it before 7, 8, 9, 10, it ain't going to happen. And it didn't happen here, and that's what's tragic to me.
Did you review the statements from Robert's parole officer, Jesse Medrano?
Yes. I referenced them earlier because she had, the parole officer, Jesse Medrano, had noted some of this bizarre relationship. And frankly, to note that type of relationship, that means you got some red flags going off when you comment on that. When a probation officer says, gee, something's cooking here, that's you have to have some real belief in that. And they're fairly good objective viewers usually. But my experience with the probation office is they've seen a lot, and if a red flag goes off in their mind, there's a good index of suspicion. And that's just collaborative and part of the data we reviewed in accepting what occurred.
And did Mr. Medrano have multiple entries about this?
Yes.
And that also provided even more support?
Yes.
What, if you can tell us briefly, because this is probably a huge question, but what are the likely effects of that kind of chronic abuse on a person's development?
I think Dr. Conti spoke well to that. I don't need to reiterate that. We do know that literature is very clear that abuse of a child and even interparental abuse at an early age is a precursor to violence often. But we didn't have a corrective. Robert never had the corrective environment to help overcome just the gross congenital defects he had, and the environment itself was toxic. At least parts of it were toxic.
You also addressed the cumulative effects in your report on Mr. Moorman of, not only the abuse, but also of his, long-standing psychiatric disabilities, physical disabilities, and whether or not those were triggers for dissociation.
this is a goulash. We can't point to any one thing that's causing this. We know there's multiple problems. He's been diagnosed with seizure disorder. He has abnormal EEGs. He's been on a myriad of medications, including antidepressant, antipsychotic, and anti-seizure medications. He's been on, if I recollect, he's been on female hormones, all treated to try and deal with what we have here. And it's because in medicine, it's not a perfect science. You know, we don't know, and he presented from birth in that fashion, as was noted when he was 2 years of age. So the cumulative effects, this man was condemned to some extent at birth, but with the rearing he had and the lack of the environment that could have been nurturing, he didn't have a chance. And the chance he's had has been in here, and he has, with the priest and some people who've been close to him, I think we can see some change. But I just feel sad, and I feel horrible for the victim. There's no question about it. But I will guarantee you, having been around a while, this will probably be you look at this gentleman, and you're not going to see anyone while sitting on this panel that will be as minimally functioning, messed up as he is. And I spent, as I said, 15 years in the county jail where a lot of them come from, and consulted here, and Governor Mofford asked me to review the DOC programs years ago with a couple other folks when there's some issues for psychiatric treatment. So I've been around a bit. I'm presently working part-time at the federal facility up north. So I mean, I'm not one of the guys who don't. I like working with inmates defense. I don't have a problem with that, but I've seen it. So I'm not just a soft liberal guy from Madison, frankly.
Does the board have any questions of Dr. Potts?
Yes, Ms. Kirschbaum. Dr. Potts?
Yes.
When you say that Mr. Moorman was condemned at birth, are you saying that there was no hope for him the moment he was born?
I'm saying that I lecture at the University of Arizona Medical School about these issues, about personality development. And about half of our genetics, half of who we are comes from genetics, our personality, style, and interaction with the world. Well, he not only had a personality style, his mother was 15, you have some problems there, and I don't know about the father and the genetics there, because we do know that people who have parents who are antisocial have a higher risk of being antisocial. Okay? But then with the field defects he had, the neurologic, physical, and physiologic defects he had, that's condemning. It could be corrective if you have a proper environment. And that's what we hope for. And that's what you can do. But then his environment, he was condemned to a degree, maybe 50%. But I've seen him come out of it. You put him in a very good corrective environment, get the right medications, the right treatment. That didn't happen. So he was condemned at birth. He was, when he was born, his chance of living a normal life were virtually zero. Let's say 30%, just get something like that. But we're much less than normal because of his cognitive deficits, all the things, walking, his clubfoot, his speech difficulties. And then when the environment didn't help and nurture him, then it went down to zero to be a normal life. That's what I mean. Because genetics is very powerful, and having congenital abnormalities on top of that is sad.
Although some people would say that no child is condemned at birth.
You know, and as a scientist, I'd say you hope not, but I know some who are because they're born in a bad environment. I've worked in Africa. You know, you look at these kids who are born malnourished, who have defects, that condemned, they could be saved. That's why you have the spiritual side. But they're not going to live a normal life. And we can try, and we thankfully in this country can try and recompense for that and make up, and we have special training programs and the like. But yes, I'd love to say that, but sadly, the thing speaks for itself. I'm an optimist. Any questions?
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your deliberation time.
I wanted to share with the board a couple of letters from Robert's cousin, Paul Schweitzer, who, if if I can get this right, is the son of Mary Schweitzer, and what was your uncle's name? Your uncle Mary's sister.
Mary was my stepdad's sister.
Bud Moorman's
Yes,
sister,
sister.
and she married Mr. Schweitzer, and their son Paul is Robert's cousin. Over the years, one of the things that was very important to Robert was for his family to know how sorry he was about his mother's death. And he and Paul, in later years, developed a relationship and began to write to each other. Paul welcomed Robert to call him, and Paul came to visit Robert at the prison. This is one of Paul's letters from December 30th, 1998. Dear Bob, so another year passes. I am glad your Christmas went well, and I hope the gift helped a little. It sounds as if you try to keep a good attitude, and that is the most important thing of all. I will try to be home on January 3rd when you call. My treatments are going well, and the doctor has said very cautiously that my cancer is in remission. If so, that is good news, but I am trying to be calm about it. Our cousin Martha came from back east to spend Christmas with me. We had a good time, and she sends best wishes. She and her husband have been divorced for 10 years now, and it has made a different person of her. It has been very warm for December and has me wondering what the late winter will bring. Well, I need my rest these days, so I will end this. I appreciate all your kind words, thoughts, and prayers. It is great we are back to family again, and I enjoy your letters. I love you. Please keep praying. All best, Paul. This is a letter from March 17th, 1999. And I'm just going to read an excerpt of it because it has a little more family news in it than you might care to hear. Dear Bob, first let me say how good it was to see you on Monday. I came away feeling very good about the way things went, and in the future, if my health permits, I will try to come again. I was both touched and moved by your telling me how sorry you are for any pain you caused my mother. The last years of her life were badly clouded, Bob, by the events of January 1984, and it was a painful thing for me to have to watch and try to deal with, especially in the last 2 years of her life. Knowing that you have a sense of what that might have been like for both her and me makes me feel better about you and about the way things went. I was impressed by your attitude of self-responsibility where your own situation is concerned, and also by your attitude of faith in placing yourself in God's hands. I hope that makes each day a little easier for you, and perhaps in time you will establish a routine of daily prayer. If you already have not done so, that will make it even easier. You often have not had an easy life, especially as a baby and small boy, I suspect, but you are not indulging in self-pity, and that, in my book, is very admirable. He ends, so once again it was good to see you. I am glad I came down. Keep on writing, and I will do the same. I love you. Best always, your cousin Paul. This was a significant change for Mr. Schweitzer from the time of Mr. Moorman's trial and sentencing, when he was very filled with grief and anger about what happened to Mrs. Moorman, and wrote a letter to Judge Royalston. But even in that time of extraordinary grief and anger, he told the judge that if if she were here, Mrs. Moorman would be the first to stand before the court to plead for leniency and understanding for the defendant. She loved him with all her heart, with the most intense mother's love I have ever seen.
Yes.
I have a question, and
Yes, ma'am.
Ellen Stenson, did family members suspect or know of the abuse?
When we were appointed on the case, it was in 1995, 1996. Most of the family members were no longer surviving. So we were able to interview very few family members. We don't have any evidence that any of them suspected the abuse.
Okay. Thank you.
Mrs. Wilkins?
When he shot his mother, and I believe that was, 1962? And as a result, he was sent to Ash, is that not correct?
That's right.
It's been about 6 weeks there.
That's right.
Did anybody explore anything at that time at Ash?
Regarding sexual abuse in the
Yes,
home.
because of the actions that happened. I know there was not a trial, correct?
That's right. Not that I'm aware of, not in any of the records that we've seen. The incident that you're referring to,
Right.
Robert had his father's shotgun in
Right.
bed. and he was home alone with his mother, and she was shot.
Supposedly was playing with the bed. He was sick.
Right. That's the about as much information as we know about the incident. And I don't recall any references to suspicions of sexual abuse at that time.
Then I was trying to relate back as to the first person he ever told anything about the sexual relations to, and I more or less came up with Dr. White, but somebody mentioned a Mrs. Baker.
Those two incidents would have been close to the same time. They were.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes. Mrs.
Living in the home of Mrs. Baker.
That's right. Elizabeth Baker ran, this is my understanding, I wasn't the one who interviewed her, but she ran a home for disabled adults where Robert lived for some period of months while he was on parole around 1979. So the report to Mrs. Baker and to Dr. White would have been around the same time. And then we have the story of his report to his father, when that's actually the first report that I'm aware of, although it's not documented in the records.
No, it's not really, but he says I think he was 7 or 8 or 9.
The first report outside the family would be...
Outside the family.
I'm not sure which came first, Dr. White or Mrs. Baker.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, Robert, you doing okay?
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to move this over so that they can hear you. Do you want to stand up or do you want to sit down?
I'm trying to stand for a while.
Okay. If you need to sit down, I can move this, okay?
Okay.
The most important thing that you wanted to do today was to say some things that you've wanted to say for a long time to your own family and also to Shelley Mickelson, who was, Ms. Mickelson was the victim that you were convicted of kidnapping in 1972. What do you want to say to Ms. Mickelson?
That I wish I could go back and undo what happened, and that I'm very sorry for any pain that caused her or her family. And I hope that someday she can forgive me for what I did, for what happened. And I wish I could, and I've told my family before that I was sorry for what happened, but I know some of them might not have heard it, but I wish that I could tell them in person that I was sorry for what I did. And wish that I could go back and change it, but I can't.
I know. How did you feel about your mom?
Well, to answer that, I'd have to really start with my biological mom. That since I found out that Mom was an alcoholic, and that I knew my grandparents were alcoholics because in 1979, Grandma told me that it took my mother's death to get them to quit drinking. And I have no harsh feelings toward my mom for being a drunk, but I think the best thing she did for me was that she signed the paperwork for me to be adopted.
And that's how you ended up with the Mormons?
Yeah.
And how did you feel about your mom and dad?
Well, I like my mom and dad because, like when I had this rock dropped on my head by two brothers, the only thing I remember was like something coming down my face, and I saw Mom running down the alley to me, and I went to her and fell into her arms, and next thing I do remember was waking up in the hospital, and Mom had the other bed in that room, and Dad used to tease me that I got more attention than he did, because she wasn't going to leave that room until I woke up. And I can't tell anybody how long I was out. But I know that there were pictures drawn by different classmates. So I figured, just by knowing that, I figured I was out for a while.
And so you know your mom loved you very much, don't you?
Yeah, she spent hours trying to teach me how to learn to read and write. And she never got mad at me when I couldn't. But she was always very, very patient. And
Now,
go Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Robert.
I did, and I know that my dad he would get age-appropriate books for me to read with him when I was in the cab with him. And he would try to help me read then. To me, I think my mom and dad helped me to read more than school did.
Well, school was tough, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I know it's extremely difficult for you, but we have to talk about what happened with your mom. All right? And it's hard for you to remember because it makes you upset.
There's
Right.
a lot of things that I don't remember, and I don't know if it's because of the stroke or what,
Yeah.
but there's just certain things I just cannot remember anymore.
And some of the memories you do have make you pretty sad.
And there's memories I wish I don't want to go into.
Right. Well, let's just do the best we can because there are some things the board might want to know.
I'll
Okay.
do my best.
All right. So there was a time in your life when you realized your relationship with your mom was different in some ways than the relationships other boys had with their moms. Do you remember when that was?
I would say part of it was when I was in my teens, because I thought that I would hear guys talk about comparing their girlfriend's
It's okay.
breast to their mother's breast. And I thought that the guy was probably doing what he would do with his girlfriend with his mom. And I know now that that's not true. But back then I kind of messed up, and I looked at things a lot differently.
So even now, all these years later, we've been talking about these things a lot over the last 2 weeks, and even now, it causes you a lot of anxiety. You've been going to the medical unit after our visits
Yeah.
and having a rough time.
There's things I don't like to talk about,
Right, okay.
because I know that things that happened were wrong.
And when you tried to tell people about those things, what happened?
Nobody wanted to believe me.
So nothing changed.
And they talked about that the first time I talked about it with Dr. White or Miss Baker, I told people way back, my parole officer, when I was a juvenile, A.J. Kirkham, that there were things going on at home that weren't right.
And nothing changed.
Nobody wanted to believe me. And I also, I can't remember the teacher, but I remember talking to one of them about it. And so I just figured it was normal. That's why nobody did anything.
Right. So we've also talked a lot the last few weeks about the night that your mom died. And
There's part of that I do not remember.
Right. You remember some fragments of that night, but there are long periods of time that you just can't.
A lot of that night, I don't know why, I just cannot recall it. I get fragments about it, different fragments, but that's it.
Okay. Okay. But you know that you killed your mom.
Yeah.
And that it was
Yes,
wrong.
I accept responsibility for what happened that night, because the only two that were in that room was her and me, and so I know that I'm the one guilty of the crime, just like I'm guilty of what happened in 72. And I wish I could go back and undo it, but I can't.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Robert.
I have a question if I can.
Do you have
Mr. Moorman, when was the first time that you thought about killing your mother? That you can remember?
No, sir, because I don't remember. Because can I correct a couple of mistakes?
Yes, sir.
The shooting of my mom in whatever year it was in 60, somebody said a shotgun. It was a 22. 22 automatic that my dad had, and they had had a whole bunch of break-ins around the neighborhood, and I was real sick, but I had the gun in my bed, and Mom came in and sat down beside me, and I was pulling it out to show it to her when it discharged. And then they sent me to the state hospital for observation. And I don't remember what all they tested me for, but I just wanted to correct that part. It wasn't a shotgun, it was a 22 automatic.
Did you ever plan to kill your mother?
No.
Did you ever want to kill your mother?
And I've heard people on the prosecution side say, oh, you did it for money. And that is 100% not true, because anytime I needed money, all I ever had to do was ask Mom. Oh yeah, I got a lecture. But at the end, Mom would say, how much did you want? And I might not get the whole amount, but I always ended up with part of it. And I was getting ready to start a business, and Mom was going to, I guess you would call it, like get stock. She would become the majority stockholder, for that way she would literally own the business.
And that business was going to be?
RHM Enterprises International.
And you were going to, what were you going to make?
Well, there was a fishing lure.
Fishing lures.
And I was thinking about special merchandise because I'd seen an ad in a newspaper, and somebody else had a family member was already doing the business, so I thought maybe that could be part of one of the other enterprises.
Mm-hmm.
But Mom and I talked about that I had a very, if I had money, I spent it. So I was very glad that Mom wanted to be in charge of the business. And I've had people tell me, oh, you did it because you're something about money, and that, to me, those people don't even know my mom. I'll shut up now.
Thank you, Robert.
You have any other?
And the reason that I asked that question, I have reviewed, like my colleagues, a lot of information on this matter, and I believe that we're going to hear from Pinell County Attorney's Office that there was a lot of evidence, if you will, pointing to the fact that Mr. Moorman planned to kill his mother at that period of time. I think I recall something about the purchasing of a knife. There were a number of things, and again, I'm sure we will hear that, where there was actually a plan to kill his mother on that 72-hour furlough on January the 12th of 1984. And so I wanted to obviously hear from you.
I had no plan, because she was going to, what they call it, she wanted me to choose an executor that would be over her estate, and she wanted me to choose between my cousin Paul and Don Nichols. And at that time, my cousin Paul and I were still not talking to each other, so I chose Don Nichols. And Mom told me when she came down on the furlough that she was going to wait till I got out on my April parole board to have me sign the paperwork. And I was already, that was fine with me, because that way Don would be in charge of the money, in charge of anything else that my mom wanted him to be. And
okay.
The purchase,
to me,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
The purchase of the knives, What the state has argued in the past is that Mrs. Moorman had cuts on her body that were before death, and so inflicted before death. And so the state's argument was that the knives had to have been purchased before she died. And actually what Mr. Moorman told the police, although he doesn't have any memory of talking to the police on the night of the crime, we don't have any reason to dispute this, that those cuts were made with a razor, which presumably was already in the room, and the knives were purchased after her death. And so what the knives, I think, are indicative of are this childlike, panicked plan after she died because something had gone so horribly wrong, and he was immensely inequipped to deal with a crisis of that proportion. And so he, with his lack of judgment and lack of problem-solving abilities, the result was this crime, what happened after the crime. But of course, what happened after the crime is completely irrelevant to any type of premeditation or planning before it.
All right, thank you. Got a question, Mrs. Wilkins?
Yes. Marilyn Wilkins, and Mr. Moorman, this question is for you. What happened that made you assault your mother that day?
To be honest, I cannot remember. And I don't remember who started it. I don't know if she did or I did.
Started what?
Whatever led to me to hurting her.
Was it an argument?
To be honest, I don't remember. I have been trying my best to remember because I've even, my own self, have been wanting to know about who started it, what was it about. Because Mom and I hardly ever argued. And that's one thing anybody that knows Mom and my mother and I, that we hardly ever argued about things. I knew that when Mom gave me advice about stuff, she was trying to help me. And if she was giving me a lecture about money, it was because I was spending too much, or I was buying things I shouldn't buy. And I had already been on 3 furloughs with her, and we had never argued on any of those. And that's why I've always tried to wonder what in the heck who started it? Did Mom, or did I, or was it a combination? I don't know. But I know that I'm responsible for whatever it was.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you. Was there any other? Yes, Mr. Lasota.
Yeah, Mr. Moorman, Jack Lasota. I'd like to talk to you briefly about the so-called codicil that was found in your cell.
Do you know what he's talking about, Robert?
After you were arrested for your mother's murder. Could you tell me about that?
Do you know what he means when he says codicil?
No. Is that letter about
to stop?
This is the letter we talked about.
That I do know about, because Mom and I had been talking on the phone about it for quite a while, because I had just got off being investigated by the Attorney General's office. And Mom said that was the part where Mom was going to become the majority stockholder of the business, and that I cannot tell you who helped. If I wrote it when Mom and I were talking on the phone, or it's somebody, one of the inmates that knew about law and legal stuff, it was helping me write it up. But I was supposed to type. Mom went over saying that something about 809 North Humphrey and something about 114 West Elm. But I can't to be honest, I can only remember that she wanted it written up in such a way that it would be part of the business or something like that. but she said that she was going to become the majority stockholder. I would be, I guess, president of it or something, but she would be the one in charge. And I was very much in favor of that, because she had better businesses than I did. Every time I tried something, it fell apart. But that's all I can remember about that piece, because my attorney showed it to me, and I remember writing part of it. And then she said something about stocks, and I said, "Oh yeah, Mom and I had talked about that way before that incident, because she asked me to have it written up, to write it up, and we would talk about it, but I had not got it typed up yet, so that's why I didn't take it with me."
Because she had funded your first business, right?
Yeah.
The driving school, and that didn't quite get off the ground.
Nope.
So now the fishing lure business was going to be the next
Yeah,
one.
that was what Mom wanted me to make sure that it worked, and that she would be in charge.
Because driving wasn't necessarily your strong suit.
Nope.
Okay.
Does that answer your question, sir?
Kind of.
All right, this is Kirschbaum.
Yes. Mr. Moorman, do you remember killing your mother?
No, ma'am.
Not at all. So you don't know how you killed her?
I remember that it was stated on a tape or something how I did it, but no.
Do you have any memory of cutting her up?
Just what certain officers had teased me about sometimes. They said that I put her fingers in a restaurant or hamburger joint downtown, that was the name of the place, Fingers. And that's the only thing I ever, because I don't remember cutting Mom up at all.
What is the recollection that you have of that day?
Oh boy. Doing a sexual act with her.
That's the only thing you remember?
Yes, ma'am. And I have been willing to take truth serum, lie detector test, or anything else that they think of. But
What kind of sex was it?
oh boy. Don't like this part.
Did you have intercourse?
No. It was me playing with her breasts. And that was the only part. And I do remember one of the other fragments that I carried her into the bathroom, put her in the bathtub, and she went under the water, and that's when I knew something was wrong.
Because you were trying to wake her up because she wouldn't wake up.
And I knew something was wrong, and I then put her back in the bed. And I do not remember cutting her up.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Mrs. Wilkins?
So that was on the first day that your mother arrived in Florence?
Yes, ma'am.
Did she ask you to touch her, or did you touch her without her wanting to be touched? Is that perhaps the argument you had?
She never, I don't remember her saying anything, or I know we talked about the business and we talked about some other things, and then.
And that's in the motel room?
Yes, ma'am. And I remember going to bed, and after that it's like nothing even
And
happened.
were you sleeping in the same bed with your mother?
No, ma'am. She had the bed closest to the door that went into the other room.
You were in another room?
No.
You were both in the same room?
Yeah, but it was like two motel rooms that had doors between them.
Right.
Well, she had the bed closest to door.
Okay.
To that door, and I had the one closest to the bathroom.
So what happened?
That I don't know. That's what I've been asking myself. I just remember her and I talked about the business and some other family things, and then I went to bed because we were going to get up and go do some shopping and some other things. And she had a little, I can't remember what it was, brown piece of paper that we were going to go down to the bank and sign.
A check?
I don't remember what it was. It was just, I just remember it being a brown piece of paper, and we were supposed to go to the bank the next day for me to sign it. And I didn't know what it was.
Okay. So then what, all right.
Then I went to bed, and
What is the next thing you remember?
that fragment about playing with her breast.
And you don't know how that came about?
No, ma'am. I do know that she was tied up, but I don't remember doing it. But I know that
Was she gagged at that moment?
I don't think so. That I don't want to say yes or no because I don't remember.
What was she saying to you?
To be honest, I'm not meaning to be disrespectful. I'm not going to make something up because I can't remember what she said.
Okay, no.
But I just remember seeing my hands doing things, and and then it just left.
What left?
The dream or whatever it was, or remembrance or whatever it was, and then ever so often I would have the one where I was taking her into the bathroom, and but I do not remember dismembering her, and I don't know about tying her up. I do not remember.
Do you remember taking her body parts to different people?
No, ma'am. Like I said, the only part about that I remember is what those guards always teased me about putting her fingers in that restaurant or whatever it was, place that was named Fingers.
And then the next thing you remember is what?
Was sitting in a car with a police officer, and then they took me to the police station, and we went to this room, and there was all kind of people there, and there was some kind of weird camera, and then I don't remember things again, and I know that some people say that there was a tape, and I don't know if there was or not. I know my attorney has gone over with me about it, and that's how I know that what it says happened. But I can only say that I'm responsible for what happened and no one else. And I wish I could go back and undo it. Because, like I said, Mom and I had been on furloughs before with her, and had no trouble, we went shopping like we were planning on doing this. And I don't know where people get these ideas that I was planning on something.
Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you.
One more question.
Is this first one?
Yes, Mr. Moorman?
Yes,
Just
ma'am.
one more question, sir.
Huh?
One more question. We heard from the Mars that are friends of yours. They read what part of your letter indicating that you were acknowledging that you have done some bad things. Well, what are you acknowledging as bad things?
Things I did when I was a juvenile, and things that with other adult women.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Minnesota?
Yeah, Mr., well, this is going to be a little delicate, but I don't know what else to do. Mr. Moorman, now you indicated one of the things that you remember in the Blue Mist Motel was fondling your mother's breasts.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, sir.
Do you remember any other sexual activity besides that?
No, sir. The only other thing I remember was carrying her to the bathroom and putting her in the bathtub. And that was, I don't remember any other sexual acts.
So you don't remember any intercourse of any kind?
Mom couldn't have intercourse because that was one thing that her dad and her used to talk about, because when Dad was stationed in San Diego, my stepdad taught recognition to the Navy, to the officers of Japanese planes and stuff. And I guess you'd say my stepbrother or my other is buried over there in San Diego because Mom gave birth. And then shortly after that, she had a total and complete hysterectomy. And
right.
She couldn't have children again, and that's why they were trying to adopt. And that's when I came around.
Well, is it then correct to say that none of it, that in the years of sexual contact that you had with your mother, intercourse was never involved?
No. There was always things that, oh boy.
That's okay. You just answered the question.
Just everything was from the belly button up.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
Our next witness is Dale Bache from the Federal Public Defender's Office.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, my name is Dale Bache. I'm with the Office of the Federal Public Defender. We represent Robert Towery, and yesterday he gave me a letter and asked me to read it to the board. Greetings. I am a prisoner here on death row. I have known Bob Moorman for nearly 20 years, and over that time, he has become a good friend, and I come to you now to speak on his behalf. Over the last 20 years or so, I have gotten to know Bob quite well, and I honestly believe it would be wrong to execute this man. Please let me explain. Bob was broken at a very young age, and as such, he has a mind of a child. Anyone speaking with him will realize this quickly. He is without a doubt the meekest man I have ever met in my life. In these long years, I have literally never heard him raise his voice in anger or even argue with anyone. He is certainly no threat to society in general, nor is he a threat to the staff or other prisoners. Bob is now an elderly man with serious health issues who simply poses no threat to anyone. Bob tends to have very childlike impulse control when it comes to certain things. An example is while we were at CB6, he was given several pouches of tobacco, enough for even the heaviest of smokers to last for days. But because it was in front of him, he smoked the entire amount overnight. The same holds true today. When he gets store items, It doesn't matter if it is 1 bag of chips or 10. He eats it all in the night, often waking in the morning to find empty containers and not knowing what happened. These are but a few examples, though they are by no means the sum of the man before you. Bob's generosity is endless. He would give his last store item to anyone who asks without pause. Again, this man is no threat to anyone, inside or out, so I respectfully ask that you spare his life. I write this letter because I care about Bob, and I want you to know what kind of man he truly is. Thank you for your time and consideration in this matter. Sincerely, Robert Towery. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
We have two final witnesses. The first is Emily Skinner from the Arizona Capital Representation Project.
Thank you, Chairman and members of the board. My name is Emily Skinner. I'm a lawyer with the Arizona Capital Representation Project. We sent a letter to the board yesterday, and I would just like to speak a little bit in support of clemency for Mr. Moorman. The death of Roberta Moorman in 1984 was inescapably tragic. For the past 28 years, as you've heard, Mr. Moorman has lived with the deep remorse he feels for causing the death of his mother. Sadly, Mr. Moorman has also lived with the painful memories of the horrific sexual abuse she inflicted upon him. Roberta adopted Mr. Moorman at age 2.5. At that young age, he was already suffering physical and mental impairments due to neglect, malnutrition, and being shuffled from foster home to foster home. As you've heard through several witnesses, the effects of this trauma occurring at such a crucial developmental age were severe and long-lasting. Rather than providing Mr. Moorman with a nurturing environment safe from the traumas of his early childhood, Roberta began to sexually abuse Mr. Moorman. As you've heard, that sexual abuse, that incestuous relationship lasted until the time of her death. In speaking to the police after his arrest, Mr. Moorman stated that his mother made him take his father's place, do things he just couldn't handle. The fact of Mr. Moorman's sexual abuse has been recognized and documented numerous times by medical professionals, his former parole officer, and even the state's mental health expert at trial. Despite the wealth of evidence regarding the sexual abuse, at his capital sentencing hearing, his counsel chose to focus on his ability to behave well in prison. Sentencing counsel didn't call any witnesses to testify to the horrific abuse, nor did he argue that it called for a life sentence. If this board decides to grant commutation, it will not be alone. In 2010 and again in 2011, the governor of Ohio granted clemency to 2 inmates when he found they had suffered brutally abusive upbringings. Just as recently as this year, the governor of Delaware granted clemency in a case where the inmate had been physically and sexually abused as a child. Similarly, Mr. Moorman's history of sexual abuse and neglect throughout his life calls for commutation of his sentence. It's beyond question that Mr. Moorman's crime was unspeakably tragic, and I wish to extend my condolences to Roberta Moorman's loved ones. There's no doubt Mr. Moorman deserves to serve a harsh sentence, and he will if this board commutes his sentence. As you've heard, he's in very poor health, and he was recently hospitalized as recent as last week. The end of Mr. Moorman's life should not come by execution at the hands of the state of Arizona. This outcome does not instill faith in our justice system. The circumstances of this case and the notions of justice call for a commutation, and I strongly urge this court to commute his sentence. I thank you, this board, I'm sorry. Thank you for your time.
Dr. Ricardo Weinstein is a neuropsychologist who's most recently evaluated Mr. Moorman. And he's going to speak, and I guess I thought I needed to use a minute while they were setting up the tech, but apparently we're better than that. But I do want to share with the board two pictures, because you heard from the mayors how much Mr. Moorman likes to write, and he also loves to draw. And so I wanted to share some of his recent artwork that he's been working on that he has shared with us in the past few weeks.
Ready? Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I will try to do it as briefly as possible. I know it's late, and what I want to convey to you is what I learned from evaluating Mr. Moorman in the last month. I came late to this case and had the opportunity of seeing him sometime at the end of January, and have seen him a couple of times since then. I want to set some basis so you can understand what I'm trying to show you. So I'll just go through a couple of slides that would explain what the brain is and how it develops. And the brain is nothing more than a conglomeration of cells. They're called axons, and those conglomeration of cells communicate with each other through electrical processes and through neurochemical processes. And that's what the brain is all about. It's a self-organizing entity. In other words, it continuously changes and organizes itself, and that self-organization is what we eventually know as how we function and how our brains function. This is just very quickly what I'm trying to explain to you here, and I apologize for the shaking. I have what it's called essential tremors. But the genes that you heard about before need to be expressed somehow, and those genes then express themselves in combination with the interaction with the environment. So we are the product of the genetics that we inherit and the environment in which we grow up. That interaction leads to, again, what we call brain function, or how our brains work. Our brains produce what we call cognition, which is understanding and learning and hearing and paying attention, and it also affect, or emotions. That leads to behavior. Behavior, again, leads to expressing our genes and affecting the environment, and it's a constant process that we all experience from the moment we are born till the time we're dead. This slide will show you how the brain develops and evolves, and why it's important to understand what happens during the first few years of life. Here on the left, you see that at birth, you see those little connections. There's very little connections happening when we're born. They're still not there. Those connections are going to be formed by the environment, by what we experience during the environment, and then you see that as a child of 6 or 8 years old, there's more connections, and finally you see 14 years old, it looks a lot more like a mixture of connections between all the cells. The other one that I want to show you very quickly here is this slide down here, or this part of the slide. What this is showing, and this is the result of a study at UCLA done fairly recently, that shows how the brain evolves, how the brain connects itself. Okay. The relevance of this slide is that shows, and just look at the purple part, okay, and this is the frontal part of the brain, that even in this is normal people, normal kids, normal individuals that have never had any drug addiction, no problems whatsoever. This is normal individuals that have not been affected in their development. And it's not until about 20 years of age that the brain matures enough, that we have a brain maturity. All of you that have kids or grandkids now that are adolescents, you'll understand the diagnosis I use, which is a psychotic adolescent syndrome. For some reason, all adolescents seem to not understand. They kind of make no sense about things. You can talk to them, they seem to understand, says, well, that happens to somebody else. And that is because their brains are not mature. Their brains are not still able to think. And this is the next slide. I want to show you, there's the different parts of the brain. And I'm just going to be concerned with the frontal lobe, which is the last part of the brain that actually gets that purple color that I showed you before. And the reason that I'm concerned about that one is because this is the functions that the frontal lobes do. Okay? Problem solving, spontaneity, memory, language, motivation, judgment, impulse control, and social and sexual behavior. So what happens when the frontal lobes don't work? Well, there's impairment in insight, reduced capacity for impulse control, lack of foresight, and socially unacceptable behaviors. That is the signs of a poorly functioning frontal lobe. Now, I'm going to talk about Mr. Moorman, because what I want to show you is that Mr. Moorman's frontal lobes never developed, and they simply don't function. So all those functions that I just mentioned have had limitations in his life. What we know, and this is just information that you have available and you reviewed, prior to being born, there were many risk factors for Mr. Moorman not to have a normal development. The first one is that his mother was pregnant at 15, and that the mother had been drinking alcohol since she was 12 years old. Mother came from a very dysfunctional family, and if you remember the connections between environment and genetics, here's the two things that Mr. Moorman had problems with: genetics and environment. There's some indication that mom was in the streets at the age of 14, and that affects her health and her development. Remember, she's still 14 years old. The brain is not developed. She received no prenatal care, and herself, mom, was diagnosed or talked about being dull normal intelligence or below average intelligence. Then what happens when Mr. Moorman, Bobby, Robert, whatever you want to call him, because he's still a child, we can call him Bobby. Bob, because some people know him. Mr. Moorman, because he expects respect. But this is what happened to him. Mom was not emotionally available. As you heard Dr. Potts say, he never had a chance. If we were going to develop a healthy brain, we have to have somebody to stimulate it and to do something positive. The father abandoned him. The biological father did not want to have anything to do with him. There was never proper attachment. Then his mother dies tragically at 17. So whatever she could have had provided for him as she developed and solved the problem was not available. She was gone. Bob was placed in foster care for the first time at the age of 3 months. And there were many multiple placement during the first 2 years. Again, we grandparents know how important, and parents of course, is to stimulate a child, to stimulate a baby, to buy him the right toys, to have him play. He had none of that. He never had an opportunity to have stimulation. In addition to that, there's evidence that he had malnutrition. You can't run a car without gas. Well, you can't run a brain without proper food. Finally, there was no medical care, and as you heard him himself talk about, at an early age, had a major crack in his head, and wasn't the only time that he had with loss of consciousness. So ultimately, he really didn't have a chance to develop a normal brain. This is the reports, this is based on the reports I read of what kind of diagnosis Bobby had experienced as a child, as an adolescent. More important is the cerebral palsy, because cerebral palsy is characterized by mental retardation and other cognitive disabilities, seizures, vision and speech impairments, attention deficits, social maladjustments, and defects in fine and gross motor skills. Bob had all of those early on and identified. By the age of 8, he was diagnosed. He was diagnosed by many different physicians, and he was observed by many people, including school principal, teachers, all of which describe him having severe problems: physical, emotional, psychological, psychiatric. This man has been given the full array of medication. If you read his records, I don't think there's one medication that has not been experimented with him, because nobody knows really what's wrong with him. I want to explain to you just very briefly what I'm trying to say when I show you figures, numbers, is that the mean is 100, the standard deviation is 15, and 70 or below represent only 2.2% of the population. That is what we're talking about here. We're talking about what percentage of the population has the limitations that Bob has. And only 2% of the population or less have those limitations. You can see here, and it's not very clear, but all these areas are about two standard deviations below the mean, or in other words, no more than maybe 2 to 5% of the people have the same limitations. And this is in overall cognitive abilities, memory, verbal memory, visual memory, processing speed. The most important one is this one, executive functions. Executive functions are what I talked about, frontal lobe function. Okay? And his cognitive flexibility, thinking before acting, thinking the consequences of his actions, very limited. This is another test which is more expansive. This is a battery of tests, and again, in two areas. He has 63, remember 70 is 2 standard deviations, so this is way below 70, and 56, way below 70. He cannot pay attention, he cannot sustain attention, and his executive functions, his decision-making process is very limited. This is confirmed by what is called a quantitative EEG. So the quantitative EEG cannot be malingered. If I know what your EEG looks like, you can't pretend it. I mean, some people may say that the test that I gave him, he could be malingering. I gave him tests to determine whether he was making a good effort or not. There's called test of effort. Gave him 4 tests of effort, he did very well. Some of the tests that I showed you also have measures of effort and malingering. So the results are real. This is not something that he's pretending, this is what's happening. Again, 2 standard deviations. Anything that's that's dark blue or that's dark pink is very abnormal in his brain. And this is the different areas of the brain that we're measuring. This is just a spectral distribution. All I want you to notice is that this is the right side of his brain, this is the left side of his brain, and that it's not symmetrical. That's the first measure that I can tell you shows very abnormal brain. All of these are statistical measurements, and if you can see it, there's a gray line over here. Okay? Anything that's above the gray line is 2 standard deviations. It's abnormal at more than 2 standard deviations. Only 2% of the population has those problems. This is when he has his eyes closed, meaning when he is not stimulated. He's not reacting to the environment. He opens his eyes, and the same thing happens. He's still not. All the gray is down here. Look at all the stuff that's above. This is his brain, and this is the frontal lobes of his brain, dark brown, dark pink, 2 standard deviations above the mean. This is his brain, again, at a different frequency. Look at everything, and this is the left side of the brain where we think intelligence. Again, more dark blue, this is bad. So anything that you see dark blue or dark pink is above or below 2 standard deviations. These are different measurements, and I'm not going to bore you with what they mean. Just trying to show you that this is a very objective way of looking at his brain, and his brain simply doesn't work. Now let me talk about mental retardation. And just as an introduction, my experience with mental retardation is twofold. One is my interest in my knowledge of the field of mental retardation from a professional point of view. The other one is I have now, he's 38 years old, a Down syndrome child or adult. that I've grown up with, and I know how he functions. He was fortunate enough, and I was fortunate enough that I knew how to stimulate him and how to help him evolve, and he's a fairly functional person. He's a very functional person. So my professional and personal experience with mental retardation is what I bring into explaining to you what's happening in this case. Very quickly, 3 things need to happen to diagnose mental retardation. This is the statute from Arizona, and that means here you have the first one, significantly sub-average general intellectual functioning. The second one is that it needs to exist concurrently with impairment in adaptive behavior, and this has to occur prior to the age of 18. And the reason that it has to occur prior to the age of 18 is because mental retardation is a developmental disability. So it has to occur during the developmental period. This is an unusual case because we have many, many times in which Bobby has been diagnosed with mental retardation prior to the age of 18, prior to committing any crime, prior to being involved in any legal proceedings. Now, this is based on 2 different scientific publications. One is the DSM-4, and the DSM-4 has the same thing, significance of average intellectual functionings, but the DSM-4 talks about specific, all this down here, adaptive behaviors, and it gives you 11 different things that you need to consider, and you diagnose mental retardation if just 2 of those things you find deficits. It doesn't matter what strengths you find. The issue is not what he can do. The issue is what he cannot do. Because the purpose of diagnosing mental retardation is to provide supportive services. And finally, the one that's really controlling in the sense, this is the institution that studies and has studied for many years mental retardation, and today is addressed as an intellectual developmental disability, with the American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disability. And what you'll see here is that those 11 behaviors that we need to look at have been grouped into 3 areas: conceptual skills, social skills, and practical skills. And you see that here, excuse me, you'll see that they each have some of the ones that are contained. What are conceptual skills? Receptive and expressive language. You yourselves just heard Bobby talk to you. He does not have fluent language, even today. If you look at his records, you'll see that there's a long history of people detailing how his speech was defective, had problems, okay? Reading and writing, well, you know, he still cannot read or write. Money concepts. He himself told you, Mom had to take care of money because if he had any money, he didn't know how to handle it. And issues with self-direction. And aspects of social interaction is interpersonal responsibility, interpersonal relationships, responsibilities, self-esteem, gullibility, naivete, following rules, obeying laws, and avoiding victimization. And finally, practical, personal activities of daily living, instrumental activities of daily living, occupational skills, and maintaining a safe environment. And I apologize if I'm going too fast, but I'm aware that everybody's kind of anxious to get out of here. I just want to emphasize that this is the characteristics of a mentally retarded individual when they reach adulthood. Basically, they have normal language. Their reading and number skills are up to the 6th grade level. They have a mental age of between 8 and 11. They exhibit the same social interests that other teens exhibit. They are able to fulfill all expected roles of adults. They get married, they drive cars, they have jobs, they have families. But they have limitations in the kind of work they can do, and they are not typically involved in adult services. Mild mentally retarded people, which is 85% of the retarded people, don't need services as an adult. Okay? They don't look mentally retarded. They don't have biological disorders, like my son has Down syndrome. They don't. It is very likely that Bobby does have. If you see him physically, you look, there's something wrong. Like Dr. Potts said, there's a syndrome. There's something wrong. I don't know what it is, but there's something different, unique. They have strengths and weaknesses, and you usually identify them because poor academic and social performance, which is, you heard his teacher, that he could see it, he could identify it, because it was present. Okay. This is a very important part of the problems with mentally disabled individuals, is their naivete and suggestibility. So it's a big problem for them to function in society because they're very gullible. The other aspect that you probably heard many people talk about today in terms of Bobby's situation is his concrete thinking. It's very concrete. He has no ability for abstract reasoning. Most important for me to convey to you is that mental developmental disability, intellectual developmental disability, it is not a disability of learning. People with mental retardation learn. They just learn in a different way, and they learn slower. What they have is a disorder of thinking. They cannot, they can get to do any job that doesn't require making decisions, or not very complicated decisions. Okay, again, the curve, because I want to show you the 70 here. And this is a phenomena that's very relevant to what we're talking in terms of achieving that 70, because the law says you have to achieve a certain number, not because in the field it's relevant. But what it says is that every 10 years, the IQ scores of a population increase by approximately 3 points. So if you test somebody with an instrument that is 10 years old, whatever score you obtain, you have to deduct 3 points to know how they compare to the population at this time and age. Okay, so what did I do to assess Bobby? I reviewed his records and I did intelligence testing. I have not had the opportunity to yet talk to any witnesses or people that could help me form the diagnosis. What sources I read school records, medical records, prison records, and the multiple collateral sources and declarations, many of which you also have. So what are his IQ scores today? Well, on a test called the Reynolds Intelligence Assessment Scales, which gives you a verbal score, a performance score or nonverbal score, and a full-scale score, his full-scale score is 75. Now this test is 10 years old, was published in 2002, and was norm, meaning the work started in 99. So for good reasons, you have to take 3 points from that. Also, you'll see here that it's a range, because psychological tests and IQ tests and intelligence tests are not an exact science. They're an estimation. And what basically this is saying is that if we tested this individual multiple times with the same test, assuming that he doesn't learn anything, and this is calculated statistically, he will have different scores. You will never get the same score. But you can be 95% sure that that score will be between these two numbers. So we know that if we take those 3 points, his IQ score is certainly around 67 to 79. But it's not like you have more of a chance to be one or the other. The point is that he does hit the 67, he is 70 or below. I gave him a second test, and if some of you may be familiar with other tests of intelligence, the WAIS, the reason I did not use the WAIS in this case is because I don't have the information about what tests were used prior to my testing, and I wanted to use something that I knew that had not been used. And this test came up in 2000. So nobody had tested him since 2000. It correlates very highly, meaning you obtain very similar scores if you use both tests. Because of the issues that we're dealing with, I wanted to know if his abstract reasoning, his ability to think abstractly, was or not commensurate with other aspects, better or worse. So I gave him a test of nonverbal intelligence, something that it doesn't require language. And in that test, his full scale was 63. So again, excuse me, his abstract reasoning is more limited than he would appear by talking to people and interacting. So I used another test, which is not an intelligence test, but it gives me information about his level of reading, word reading, sentence comprehension, and spelling. And his scores are very low, and this is the grade equivalent. He can read words at the third grade level. He has something unique that I have not seen in 25 or 30 years of working and doing this kind of work, is he is not able to look at a word and put the word together. He can only read the word when he sounds letter by letter, which is a very primitive way of reading, but he's trained himself to do it. Because of that, and he cannot recognize, his spelling is very, very limited and very, he can spell words that he's familiar with and that he knows well, but words that he doesn't read on a regular basis, he has no ability to do that. His reading comprehension is actually better. He can read and understand things better than he can sound words or spell. Okay. This is a list of what I call conceptual skills that I think exist in his deficits. He's unable to achieve academically. He only received social promotions. He graduated, but through social promotions. His expressive and receptive language was limited and had problems. You can see that he had incomprehensible speech and poor ability to communicate. He has poor understanding of the world. You read in your materials that that's how he's been described. He could not understand nuances, and he has very concrete thinking. And finally, he has lack of self-direction. You have to tell him what to do. And that's why he's doing so well in prison. He doesn't have to make any decisions. They're made for him. It is a very sad story to tell you that when I spoke with Bobby, I asked him, when's the happiest time of your life that you remember? And he goes, here. Because there's no pressures on him, because nobody is taunting him, because he can just be who he is. Social skills, obviously he never developed interpersonal skills. He was described as a loner and being isolated. He was easily influenced by others and gullible. Mind you, I only had to find one of these areas where he had deficits to be able to diagnose mental retardation. I didn't need to have him in the three of them. He has in the three areas that we talked about. And practical skills, he never lived independently. Every time he tried to run away, he ran away back to home. He was institutionalized at an early age, and he just couldn't live by himself. He could drive a car, and you heard him, he tried to start a school. I think it lasted for a week. He also tried to drive a taxi. When I asked him how he did that, he said, well, I learned how to go to the airport, and I learned how to go to the bus station, but I couldn't take people anywhere else. So his job as a taxi driver didn't last. And he was a taxi driver because his father owned a taxi company. But he couldn't do it. That's the point. Obviously, because this is based on all the information I obtained prior to the age of 18, the third prong of mental retardation is fulfilled. He was diagnosed with mental retardation prior to the age of 18 by numerous different professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, all kinds of different social workers, whoever was involved in his life, teachers, saw it and diagnosed it. Okay, so I don't know that you can see this well enough. I wish you could, but this is just a list of risk factors. You don't need to have any theology. You don't need to know why somebody's mentally retarded to diagnose it. But what I'm showing you is risk factors that have been identified. Okay? And if we go down the line, you'll see that at least 80% of the risk factors apply to Bobby. Okay? From chromosomal problems, meaning genetic issues, from mother being too young, from mother never having any care, from not being identified early enough, to not being provided the proper services, to growing up without stimulation, to malnutrition. Again, trust me, I don't want to bother you or bore you with going one by one, but about 85 to 90% of what you see here in this list applies to Bobby. So, what's the relevance of mental retardation in what we're talking about here? The relevance is that in 2002, by a time which nobody had then or since then evaluated Bobby for mental retardation, you cannot execute mentally retarded people. And you cannot execute mentally retarded people, the decision is very long. But I just wanted to emphasize a couple of things that I hope I showed you that are problems in Bobby's life. And that is, the Supreme Court says you don't execute mentally retarded people because they have reduced capacity. Reduced capacity. Doesn't mean they can't do it. It's just their capacity is reduced, less than you would have from a person that's not retarded. In what? In reasoning, judgment, and control of their impulses. What's the part of the brain that controls that? The frontal lobes. What did I show you doesn't work in Bobby? The frontal lobes. This is another part, and I don't know that in this case, we're not talking of a false confession, but what we're talking about is a person that acknowledges that he committed a crime for which he has no memory. Also, the American Bar Association says there's reasons why you don't execute people. This is a position from the American Bar Association, and again, have to do with mental retardation, dementia, traumatic brain injury, because of the reduced capacity, because they don't have the same capacity that everybody else has, because their decision-making process is limited. And again, defendants should not be executed if at the time of the offense they had a severe mental disorder or disability that significantly impaired their capacity. You heard from many different professionals, both in person, in video, and through testimony or through declarations, that this man has severe mental disorders and disabilities. We know that his upbringing, we know that his birth, we know that his tragic life led to all this. And I want to emphasize something. Sexual abuse is not necessarily intercourse. Sexual abuse is a violation that occurs in a situation of power. You heard Bobby himself tell you he didn't know that what was going on with his mother was wrong because he thought everybody did it. And I've, over the course of my profession, have dealt with many victims of sexual abuse and perpetrators of sexual abuse, and kids will tell you that. Why didn't you say something? So I thought that was normal. I thought that's what happened to everybody. It's not until they reach their teens and they find that they're starting to explore their own sexuality that they realize there was something wrong. Being developmentally delayed is a lot the result of the environment. Being sexually abused, whether intercourse occurred or did not occur, is one of the major reasons why his brain never developed healthily. You know, it's not, the trauma is the result of the power and the abuse of a situation, not of the particular acts that occur or the frequency of them. and that's in the literature. Finally, this is what I think happened to Bobby. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but there's an old story, The Blind Man and the Elephant. And the story itself is kind of weird because some say it's a Sufi story, some say it's a Hindu story, a Buddhist story. So not even people agree on that. But what it is the story about different men that were touching an elephant. They're all blind. And each of them was touching part of it. So the man says, hey, the elephant is a pillar, said the first man who touched his leg. Oh no, it's like a rope, said the second man who touched the tail. Oh no, it's like a thick branch of a tree, said the third man who touched the trunk of the elephant. It is like a big hand fan, said the fourth man who touched the ear of the elephant. It's like a huge wall, said the fifth man who touched the belly of the elephant. And it's like a solid pipe, said the sixth man who touched the tusk of the elephant. Why do I put this here? Because this is the tragic story of Bobby. Bobby has been seen by many, many different professionals and by many different people. And everybody looks at one part of Bobby. And Bobby has not been seen as a full person so far. Some people may say he's evil, some people may say he's retarded, some people may say he's schizophrenic, some people may say he's a victim of abuse. He's a human being, he's a person. All of those things would take all of us together to be able to describe the complexity of Mr. Moorman. You heard Dr. Potts say it, and I can tell you I've been doing this for more than 30 years. He's one of the most complex cases I've ever worked with, because it's a challenge to find the proper diagnosis, because it's been a challenge to provide the proper treatment. And the only thing I can tell you is, after 30 years of experience and about 10 hours of spending with Bobby, with Mr. Moorman, whatever he tells me, I believe him. And I don't usually believe people that are in the criminal system without questioning stuff. So if you have any questions or comments.
All right, thank you, sir.
And sorry I rushed it.
Okay. Was that it? No, does anyone want to?
We probably need another break.
Yeah, we want to maybe take another quick break before you go on. Okay, thank you.